Hannah Miller was 8 months pregnant broke and running out of time when she won an abandoned farmhouse in Missoula, Montana for $1. She thought she'd found a quiet place to give her baby a future, but beneath those frozen floors, her loyal shepherd ranger uncovered something buried deep, something the government once tried to erase. What followed wasn't just survival. It was a battle between truth and silence, faith and fear of life, and the fire that sleeps beneath the earth. This is the story of a mother's courage, a dog's devotion, and the miracle that waited beneath the snow. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and the strength that still lives in the quiet hearts of those who refuse to give up. Snow fell in quiet sheets over Missoula, Montana, muffling every sound except the steady hum of an old pickup truck crawling up a half-frozen dirt road. Inside, Hannah Miller, 31, gripped the steering wheel tight, her knuckles pale against the cracked leather. 8 months pregnant and running mostly on determination and caffeine, she looked like a woman the world had already tried to break but hadn't quite succeeded. Her once auburn hair had grown dull from sleepless nights, falling loosely around a face lined not with age but with endurance. Her eyes, gray-green, like thawing ice, carried the restless mix of fear and faith only a mother could hold. The baby kicked hard as if echoing her unease. She smiled faintly. "Easy there, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're almost home, whatever that means now." In the passenger seat sat Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat and one ear that refused to stand straight. He had the calm, steady presence of an old soldier, alert, but not anxious, loyal without question. Once a rescue dog from a sheriff's department, he had been retired after a leg injury, the faint scars still visible under his fur. To Hannah, Ranger wasn't just a dog, he was the last living creature she trusted. When the truck crested the hill, the farmhouse appeared, a weather-beaten skeleton of a home surrounded by knee-high grass stiff with frost. The porch sagged, one shutter hung loose, and the paint had peeled down to gray timber that looked as old as the mountain behind it. The sign on the gate, barely legible, under ice, read, "Iron Creek Road, Parcel 12. "This is it," she said quietly. Her breath fogged the glass as she stopped the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your heartbeat. The house had come from a government auction, an abandoned property sold for $1, and a back tax bill of $4,600 she could barely afford. It wasn't supposed to be a dream house, just a place to stop running. She'd left behind a failed marriage, a city that didn't care, and a hospital bill that still haunted her voicemail. Now here she was pregnant, freezing, and standing in front of a house that leaned like it wanted to fall, but hadn't yet. Maybe they had that in common. Ranger jumped down first, nose twitching. He sniffed the air, ears tilting toward the distant ridge where snow clouds gathered like smoke. Hannah wrapped her wool coat tighter around her belly and followed her boots crunching through the frost. Each step sank deep, releasing a faint smell of pine and rot. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Dust coated everything, the table, the stove, the cracked porcelain sink. A single curtain fluttered against the window, letting in a blade of cold light. Hannah traced a finger over the worn counter and whispered, "Well, little one, we've had worse." She unpacked what little she owned, 2 duffel bags, a box of canned food, and a folded sonogram photo. Setting it on the mantel, she stared at it for a long time. The tiny shape inside the blur reminded her why she'd come to start over somewhere no one knew her name. That night she lit the old wood stove with trembling hands. The fire caught slowly, the flames casting orange light across the warped walls. Ranger curled beside her sleeping bag, his nose twitching in dreams. Hannah listened to the wind scraping against the house, each groan of the timber like the mountain breathing. The heat made her drowsy, and for the first time in months, she felt almost safe. Until Ranger stirred. He stood abruptly, ear-sharp, eyes fixed on the narrow staircase leading to the attic. His low growl broke the quiet. Hannah frowned. "What is it, boy?" He didn't move, just stared, tense, tail stiff. Then he padded toward the stairs, sniffing, pawing at the lowest step. The sound was hollow. Hannah's pulse quickened. She grabbed her flashlight and crouched beside him. "There's nothing there," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. She tapped the wood, a faint echo. She pressed her hand against the riser, noticing a small gap near the corner. When she pulled, a loose board gave way, revealing a dark slit barely wide enough for a hand. The smell that came out was old, like paper and dust mixed with oil. Inside, wrapped in brittle brown cloth, was an envelope sealed with red wax. The seal had cracked from age, the wax stamped with a symbol she didn't recognize. The handwriting across it was thin, shaky, but clear. Don't trust Lolo Ridge. Her breath caught. The ridge she'd seen, the name on the map, stretching behind the property like a spine of gray stone. She laughed softly, trying to shake the chill. Well, Ranger, she said, half to herself. Guess we've got neighbors after all. The dog tilted his head, eyes gleaming in the firelight. But then the floor shifted beneath them just slightly, like something deep in the earth had sighed. The lamp flickered, the glass rattled. Hannah froze, every instinct sharpening. Ranger growled again, low and uncertain. Then just as suddenly, the tremor stopped. Hannah exhaled, forcing a laugh that came out thin. Probably nothing she said, though her hand remained on her belly as if to shield the child from something unseen. Just the house settling. But in her chest, a thought lingered, settling into what? She slid the envelope onto the table and sat beside the fire. Sleep didn't come easily. Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the cracks like a voice that almost knew her name. And in the dim flicker of the stove's dying flame, the red wax seal caught the light one last time, gleaming faintly like an eye that had just begun to open. Morning crept into the farmhouse through narrow slats of light that painted the floor in faint gold stripes. The air smelled of wood smoke and melted snow. Hannah Miller, still wrapped in yesterday's coat, stirred awake to the soft thump of Ranger's tail against the floorboards. Her body ached from sleeping on the old cot, and the baby kicked restlessly, reminding her that comfort was now a luxury she couldn't afford. She rubbed her belly and whispered, "You and I are tougher than we look, little one." Ranger gave a quiet huff as if agreeing. The dog was restless that morning, pacing near the back door. When Hannah finally opened it, the wind bit her cheeks, sharp and bright. Ranger darted across the yard toward a small shed half buried in frost. Its roof sagged like a tired back, and the hinges screamed when she pulled the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rust and earth. Ranger sniffed at a pile of crates, his nose twitching fast. He began to paw furiously at the dirt floor until his claws struck something solid, a metallic clang. Hannah crouched, brushing away the soil. Beneath it lay a small tin box, dull with age but intact. The latch resisted her gloved fingers but finally gave way. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oil-stained canvas, were yellowed papers, folded maps, and a small leather-bound notebook. She carried them back inside, spreading everything across the kitchen table under the weak light of morning. The maps were hand-drawn lines of ridges and streams, coordinates scribbled in faint pencil. Several black X's marked points along what appeared to be the north face of Lolo Ridge. In the margin, a line of faded ink read, "Depth verified. Magnetic anomaly confirmed. Primary chamber, North Lolo. Magnetic anomaly." Hannah murmured, tracing the words with her finger. "Guess I'm not the only one acting strange around here." She smiled weakly and glanced at her belly. "You hear that, sweetheart? Mommy's got heartburn, and the mountain's got anomalies." "Seems fair." She opened the notebook. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The first page bore a name, Evan Greer, followed by U.S. Geological Survey, Field Division. The entries dated back to the early 1960s. Most of them were simple notations, temperature, soil readings, and sketches of terrain, but the later pages grew erratic. One entry read, "Interference increasing." The readings spike at night. "Possible seismic chamber," or something else. The next page had only 3 words, "Don't go deeper." Ranger rested his head on her lap, eyes steady but alert. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered. Haunted mountain or bad handwriting? By noon, the road outside crackled with the sound of tires over frozen gravel. Hannah stepped onto the porch just as an old postal truck came into view. The man who climbed out moved slowly but solidly, like someone who'd spent a lifetime walking uphill. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, but stooped slightly with age. His face was lined deep around the mouth, beard trimmed close to the jaw, and his hands, thick cracked from years of Montana winters, gripped the mailbag like it was part of him. His name tag read Harold Green. "Morning, ma'am," he called, his voice gravelly but kind. "You must be the new owner of the Miller property. Or should I say the brave one?" Hannah smiled politely, brushing snow from her hair. "I guess that depends on how you define brave. If it means broke and desperate, then yes, that's me." Harold chuckled, the sound carrying a warmth that didn't match the cold air. Most folks round here wouldn't touch this place. Belonged to a fella named Greer once. Government man. Came up in the 60s, said he was studying rocks or some such. Then one winter, poof, gone without a trace. He tapped the brim of his cap. They never found so much as his truck. The name struck her like a small jolt. Evan Greer, she asked, trying to sound casual. That's the one, Harold said, eyes narrowing slightly. You heard of him? Found some of his old maps, she admitted. Looks like he was working near the ridge. Harold's gaze drifted toward the horizon where Lolo Ridge loomed dark and silent against the white sky. Then you be careful, ma'am. That mountain's got a way of keeping secrets. Some say the air up there isn't right. Compass won't hold steady. You asked me, that's reason enough to leave her alone. He handed her a small envelope with official stamps. County records, probably your deed. Then after a pause, he added softly, this land remembers Miss Miller. More than most people care to believe. When the truck disappeared down the road, Hannah stood for a long while staring at the ridge. The wind pushed through the pines with a low hum that almost sounded like breathing. She turned back toward the house, clutching the notebook close. Inside, she sat by the stove, feeding another log to the flames. Ranger lay nearby, one paw twitching in his sleep. The warmth filled the room, but her thoughts wandered elsewhere to Greer, to the warning, to the hum she thought she'd felt beneath her feet the night before. She unfolded the largest of the maps again, spreading it carefully across the table. Her eyes followed the lines north until they reached the cluster of X's at the ridge. Depth verified, she read aloud. Primary chamber. The words meant nothing to her, and yet they filled her with a strange pull. Maybe it was foolishness. Maybe it was something older, like destiny, whispering through old paper. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't found this place by accident. She'd been led here by debt, by desperation, or perhaps by the mountain itself. Outside, the light began to fade, turning the snow pink and gold. The wind shifted, carrying a deep, distant sound like a door closing somewhere underground. Hannah pressed a hand to her stomach and whispered, we're staying, sweetheart. Not because we're stuck, because something here wants us to. Ranger stirred, ears twitching. For the first time since she had arrived, Hannah felt something close to peace. Not safety, but purpose. And outside under the ridge, something listened. By the next afternoon, the storm clouds had thinned, leaving Missoula wrapped in a fragile stillness that felt too perfect to trust. Hannah Miller stood by the cracked window, sipping black coffee gone cold. Ranger lay near the door, his tail flicking every few seconds, as if some quiet instinct warned him that peace was not meant to last. She had just begun to review Evan Greer's notes again when she heard a distant hum of tires over gravel. Out front, a black SUV rolled to a stop at the gate, its paint gleaming unnaturally clean against the dirt and frost. The door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his 40s, tall and deliberate in his movements, wearing a dark wool coat over a tailored suit that didn't belong this far north. Marcus Hale looked like someone who had never been late a day in his life. His face was angular, every feature, precise square jaw, narrow nose, thin lips that seemed permanently curved into a polite half-smile. His eyes, pale gray and sharp as winter glass, scanned the property with the cool detachment of a man inspecting inventory rather than a home. There was no wedding ring on his finger, but a faint tan line showed there once had been. Whatever had broken that marriage had probably been the same thing that made his tone so measured, someone who lost softness the day he learned money could solve almost everything. Mrs. Miller, he called as he approached, his voice smooth enough to sound trustworthy if you didn't know better. Marcus Hale, Apex Minerals, may I? He gestured toward the porch. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. You're trespassing? Technically, she said, but I'll give you 5 minutes before my dog decides otherwise. Marcus smiled politely, though his gaze flicked briefly toward Ranger, who had risen to his feet. Muscles tense, tail low. Impressive animal, Marcus said. German Shepherd, correct, retired canine. Hannah replied, setting her mug down. And he's not a fan of a salesman. Then I'll be quick. He reached into his coat and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table between them. Inside, a single sheet of paper with typed figures, clean, formal, almost sterile. Apex Minerals is expanding its environmental research operations across western Montana. We'd like to acquire this land for sampling and geological observation. You'd be compensated fairly $200,000 in cash. Hannah's laugh came out sharper than she intended. Environmental research. That's a generous way of saying drilling. He didn't flinch. We prefer to think of it as discovery. This ridge has unusual magnetic properties. Of course, you'd still own neighboring rights. Apex only wants temporary access to the ridge and your lower field. Ranger growled quietly, the sound low and even. Marcus kept his eyes on Hannah. You could start fresh somewhere else, he said softly, for you and your child. Think of it as an investment in safety. That word safety made her blood heat. You think I'd sell peace for money? You don't even know me. Marcus tilted his head slightly. No, but I know desperation when I see it. I'm offering you freedom from it. She met his gaze, her voice calm but sharp. Freedom doesn't come from men like you. It comes from standing your ground. For a second, something in his expression changed, a flicker of irritation quickly buried beneath that practiced smile. He closed the folder, slid it back into his coat and stood. Then I'll leave you to your independence. He started toward the SUV, pausing halfway to add, if you change your mind, Mrs. Miller, Apex never leaves a conversation unfinished. Then he was gone, the hum of the engine fading into the trees. That night, the farmhouse seemed quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes the walls feel thinner. Hannah sat by the window knitting a blanket from leftover yarn, something to calm her nerves. Ranger stirred suddenly, his ears snapping upright. He padded to the back door, growling. Hannah followed, flashlight in hand. Outside behind the house, a faint red light blinked once, then again, steady, mechanical. She found it wedged under the gutter, a small camera the size of a matchbox, its lens glinting in the moonlight. Her pulse spiked. She fetched an old screwdriver from the shed and pried it loose, muttering under her breath. You picked the wrong mother to spy on. She cracked the back open, removed the battery, and tossed the device into the stove until the plastic hissed and melted. When morning came, a knock echoed on the front door. Standing there was a woman in a sheriff's deputy uniform, her badge catching the early light. She looked to be in her mid-30s with pale skin touched by sunburn, sharp brown eyes, and hair pulled tightly into a regulation bun. Her nameplate read Deputy Nora Finch. She carried herself like someone who had learned to balance authority and exhaustion. Chin-high, shoulders back, but with the faint hollowness of a person who'd seen too much and been thanked too little. Morning, ma'am, she said. I'm here on behalf of the county. We've had reports of poachers and trespassers around Lolo Ridge. I wanted to make sure you're secure. Hannah stepped aside slightly, her tone guarded. You're a little late. Someone was on my property last night. Left a camera behind. Finch raised a brow, jotting something in her notebook. Camera, you said, could be hunters using trail cams. Still, that's not legal without notice. You mind if I take a look? Hannah led her around back. The melted plastic and battery remains sat inside a metal bucket. Finch crouched beside it, poking the fragments with a pen. Not your usual hunting gear, she murmured. Mind if I ask who's been visiting you? Hannah hesitated, then said a man named Marcus Hale, Apex Minerals. Something in Finch's posture stiffened just barely. Haven't heard that name in a while, she said carefully. They've been sniffing around here for years. Best not to get involved. She stood brushing her gloves clean. Her face returned to a professional calm, eyes unreadable. If anything else happens, call the station. We'll send someone up. Will that someone actually come? Hannah asked. Finch gave a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. Depends who's asking. She turned, walking back toward her cruiser. The tires crunched over ice as she left, and Hannah stood watching the dust trail fade. Later that afternoon, while cleaning the staircase where she'd first found the sealed envelope, Hannah's hand brushed against another loose panel. She pried it open carefully and drew out a small metal cylinder engraved faintly with USGS 1958. Inside was a rolled scrap of paper and a lingering smell of oil. The note read simply, "Do not go deeper." She stared at it for a long time, the words heavy in her palm. Then she looked toward the window where Lolo Ridge cut the horizon in jagged silence. Sorry, she whispered to the mountain. You should know by now, I don't follow rules. Ranger's tail flicked once, slow and steady, as if to agree. By the next evening, the wind from the mountains had turned sharp enough to sting, sweeping through the pines like a warning. The map from Evan Greer lay unfolded across the kitchen table, edges weighed down by a wrench and an empty coffee mug. Hannah Miller stared at the cluster of black X's marked North Lolo, her breath clouding in the cold air. Something about that ridge tugged at her, not fear exactly, but a need to know. She packed a flashlight, her old camera, and a first aid kit into her worn leather satchel. Ranger waited by the door, tail still, his amber eyes fixed on her as though he already understood where they were going. "You're not staying here alone," she said softly. "You'd only dig up the yard again. Anyway." The hike toward the ridge took hours. Snow drifted steadily, settling on their coats and muffling their steps. The world shrank to white, in silence broken only by the crunch of boots and Ranger's rhythmic breathing. When they reached the foot of the slope, the map guided her toward a crevice, hidden behind twisted spruce roots. She brushed aside ice and debris until a narrow opening revealed itself barely wide enough for a person. Ranger slipped through, first nose, low tail brushing the stone. Hannah followed her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The air inside was damp and metallic, the walls cold against her shoulder as she moved. About 20 yards in, the passage widened into a small chamber carved by both nature and human hands. The rock glistened faintly, as if dusted with frost that never melted. On one wall, the initials EG were scratched deep, and beside them, a rusted tape recorder rested on a crate, its battery panel corroded but intact. Hannah brushed off the dust and pressed play. After a hiss of static, a man's voice filled the space, measured, weary American accent roughened by age and isolation. "Field note Evan Greer, day 26. It reacts to light, frequency unknown. Emits low harmonic vibrations, not of terrestrial origin. I repeat, not of terrestrial origin." Hannah froze. The words echoed against the rock, soft and impossible. Ranger whined quietly, backing a step toward her. She lifted her flashlight toward the far wall, and that's when she saw it, a thin fracture running vertically from floor to ceiling, glowing faintly blue, as if the mountain itself was bleeding light. The glow pulsed rhythmic, alive. She approached, hand trembling. The warmth radiating from it was wrong for stone, soft, almost like breath. "What did you find, Evan?" she whispered. Outside, thunder cracked, though there were no clouds visible when they entered. A gust of wind howled down the tunnel, carrying a deep rumble from above. Ranger barked sharply. Hannah turned off the flashlight and grabbed his collar. The blue glow flickered brighter, then dimmed, as if retreating. They stumbled out into the open air, just as the first flakes of a full-blown blizzard began to fall. Snow lashed across the ridge, erasing the trail they'd come by. From below came a mechanical roar. Engines, drills, voices, shouting orders. Through the haze of snow, she saw lights, construction, flood lamps cutting across the white. Apex. The company was drilling directly into the ridge, their heavy machinery vibrating through the ground. She crouched behind a boulder, clutching her belly as the baby kicked violently. "Not now," she whispered, half laughing, half panicked. Ranger barked at the machine's teeth bared before she pulled him close. Then a flash, blue-white and searing. One of the drills hit something deep. The light that burst from the hole was not fire, not lightning, but something between the two, a silent explosion of color that danced across the snow. The workers screamed. Hannah saw silhouettes scrambling before another flash consumed the camp. A wave of heat tore through the ridge. She felt it slam her chest like a hand. Ranger yelped, stumbling. Then the world went white. When she opened her eyes again, that she was lying half buried in snow, her ears ringing. Smoke rose from below. Ranger limped toward her first, singed along his flank. "Oh God," she gasped, pulling him close. His breathing was shallow but steady. She tore strips from her scarf, wrapping the burn as best she could. The farmhouse, she had to get back. But when she looked toward the valley, the sight made her throat close. The roof of her home was ablaze, flames twisting orange against the storm-gray sky. She half-carried, half-dragged Ranger down the slope, slipping, sliding, clutching at roots for balance. By the time they reached the yard, half the structure had collapsed. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if protesting the chaos. She sank to her knees in the snow, sobbing not from despair, but exhaustion. Then came the distant sound of an approaching engine. The sheriff's cruiser stopped at the edge of the property, headlights cutting through the smoke. Nora Finch emerged, face pale beneath her hat, snow streaking her lashes. "Hannah," she shouted, rushing forward. Together they pulled Ranger into the car and cranked the heater to full. Finch's gloved hands trembled slightly as she handed Hannah a thermal blanket. "What happened?" Hannah managed, voice hoarse. Finch hesitated before speaking. "Apex. They were drilling under emergency permits. Said it was for groundwater research." Her jaw clenched. "But I've seen the reports, Hannah. Whatever's under Lolo Ridge, it's not groundwater. It's something that generates heat. If it spreads, this valley will burn from beneath. Hannah stared at her, disbelief giving way to anger. You knew. Finch's voice cracked just a hint. I tried to stop them, but Apex owns half the county budget. You can't fight a machine that feeds everyone's paycheck. She met Hannah's eyes. But maybe you can still stop what's coming. Whatever Greer found, it's waking up again. Lightning split the sky outside, followed by another tremor that rattled the cruiser. Finch grabbed the steering wheel. We need to move. Now. As they sped away from the burning house, Hannah looked back one last time. Through the snow, she could see faint pulses of blue light flashing along the ridge like a heartbeat beneath the mountain's skin. She held her belly tightly, whispering to the life within her. Hold on, just a little longer. Ranger lifted his head weakly from her lap, eyes open, watching the glow fade into the storm. By dawn, Missoula was silent again. The storm had passed, leaving the sky raw and colorless. Smoke drifted from the charred remains of Hannah's house, curling upward like the last breath of something ancient and stubborn. She stood among the ashes, her coat singed, her cheeks streaked with soot. Beside her, Ranger limped but stayed upright, his eyes following her every move with the unspoken devotion of a creature who had already given everything. Her belly felt heavy and alive, the baby restless inside, as though even it could sense the tremor still humming beneath the ground. The ridge was glowing faintly again, the blue light pulsing slow and deliberate like a heartbeat waiting for its next command. Nora Finch parked her cruiser by the broken fence, stepping out with a folder clutched tight to her chest. The deputy looked older than she had the night before. Exhaustion had softened her sharp features, and her usual composure was cracking. It's spreading, she said without preamble. The ridge lit up again around 4 a.m. I called it in, but the state line's radio is dead. Apex pulled out overnight. No sign of hail. Hannah met her eyes, voice low. Then it's just us. Nora nodded, and whatever's under there. She opened the folder and handed Hannah several sheets, scanned copies of Evan Greer's final logs. The handwriting grew erratic with each page until the last line simply read, "It's alive and it feeds on heat." The words hung between them. Hannah traced them with her thumb, then looked toward the ridge where plumes of mist now rose from the cracks, like breath in the cold. Then I'll starve it, she said. Finch blinked. You can't go up there. You're barely standing. Hannah smiled faintly. I'm standing enough. She turned toward Ranger, who tilted his head, ears twitching. You ready, partner? They gathered what they could, fuel canisters left behind by the Apex crew. Road flares, rope, and a lighter Finch had pulled from her jacket pocket. The two women moved through the snow in grim silence. The air smelled metallic, heavy, as if the earth itself was sweating. At the mouth of the cave, the glow had grown stronger. The fracture in the stone throbbed with light waves of blue rippling beneath the rock, as though the mountain had veins. The temperature climbed with every step. Ranger's fur bristled, and Finch's face shone with sweat despite the freezing wind outside. Hannah set down the canisters, her movements slow but precise. Help me line these along the cracks, she said. Finch hesitated, then obeyed, her hands shaking as she passed each one down. The baby kicked again, sharp and insistent. Hannah winced but smiled. Easy little fighter, she whispered. We're almost done. When the final canister was in place, Hannah twisted the cap off a flare and held it near the fuel line. The light painted her face orange, making her look carved from the same fire she was about to unleash. You don't have to do this, Finch said, voice breaking. I'm not destroying it, Hannah replied softly. I'm sealing it back where it belongs. Ranger barked once, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the tunnel. Hannah crouched beside him, stroking his muzzle. Stay back, boy. She looked at the deputy one last time. If I don't make it out, take these. She handed Finch the notebook, the one Greer had written in, and a folded sonogram photo tucked inside. Finch swallowed, hard tears gathering despite the heat. You'll make it, she said. Maybe, Hannah answered. But even if I don't, my child will. And with that, she dropped the flare. For a moment, time froze. The flame ignited the trail of fuel in a blinding rush of color. The explosion thundered through the ridge, shaking snow loose from the peaks. A wall of molten rock folded inward, collapsing over the crack. Light burst outward, blue and white, before dimming into gray. The sound that followed wasn't violent, it was deep and sorrowful, like the mountains sighing in relief. When Finch opened her eyes, the cave was half buried in stone. Smoke and steam filled the air thick and acrid. She shouted Hannah's name, stumbling forward, but there was no answer. Only Ranger limping toward her from the shadows, first singed but alive. And then from the far side of the rubble, she heard a faint cough. Hannah emerged crawling, covered in ash, one hand clutching her stomach. Finch ran to her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You did it?" the deputy whispered. Hannah smiled weakly. "No," she said, "the mountain did." Hours later, federal helicopters arrived too late to stop anything, just in time to witness the quiet aftermath. Finch turned over Greer's files to a reporter from the Missoulian, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, named Samuel Ortiz, known for his calm persistence and weathered kindness. He promised to publish everything as it was meant to be told. By the next morning, the fire was out, the ridge silent. The ground where the farmhouse once stood still radiated a faint warmth, like the heartbeat of something sleeping again. Hannah stood there wrapped in Finch's old coat, her hair tangled, her face streaked with soot but peaceful. Ranger sat beside her, tail sweeping softly through the ash. She looked at the valley and whispered, "Home." The wind carried the word away, and for once the mountain did not echo back. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or angels. They come quietly through a mother who refuses to give up, a loyal dog who stands guard in the storm, or a mountain that finally learns to rest. Maybe what Hannah found wasn't just light beneath the earth, but faith, the kind that burns steady, even when the world feels cold and empty. In our lives, too, there are cracks that glow. Moments when everything seems lost, yet something divine whispers, "Hold on." Because God's grace doesn't always shield us from the fire, sometimes it carries us through it. He turns endings into beginnings, ruins into homes, and fear into the quiet courage to rebuild. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment about a moment when you felt God's hand guiding you, even in silence. And don't forget to subscribe so together we can keep spreading stories of faith, hope, and the small miracles that walk among us every day. May the Lord bless and protect every heart watching this, and may you always find your way home, no matter how far the storm carries you.